I will dive in and introduce our fifth and final speaker today, Jonathan Swain from NFU Energy. So John is the technical director. He has been involved in all areas of NFU Energy since 2002. John has expertise in technical consultancy, renewable energy and energy scheme compliance. He's worked directly with the farming sector throughout the government's renewable heat incentive scheme and in setting up sustainability projects such as the Sustainable Fuel Register. In recent years, John has consulted on all manner of renewable projects, especially in anaerobic digesters and biomass heating. From his experience in industry, he understands the complexities and challenges facing the sector in achieving its net zero targets by 2040. John's presentation today will explore these challenges and discuss how we actually develop a net zero strategy. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Conscious that I stand between you and lunch, but that's the way it is, isn't it? And I'm just hopefully good. Okay, so yes, thank you for that introduction. I'm John Swain, as I work for NFU Energy, which is an organisation that has been around in many guises, previously known as the Farm Energy Centre, or Farm Electric back in the late 60s, early 70s, and was recently purchased by the NFU as a strategic purchase to sort of integrate some of the actions that people need to take on farm with some of their policy requests and requirements. And so, yes, it's about taking the action further than just talking about it, as the NFU recognise. So we're part of that strategic aim of theirs to put their money where their mouth is in terms of the current net zero commitments that there are out there. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. You'll also see that on the top of my slide, there's an AHDB logo. So that's like Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board logo. A lot of the work that we do in horticulture in the past especially has been funded by AHDB through what we call our Grow Save programme. And Grow Save is a programme that aims to get or upskill and get knowledge out there to the horticultural industry about saving energy and reducing costs in their production. Protected horticulture is one of those areas that's quite often forgotten about in agriculture, but is by far the biggest energy consumer in its own right. It uses staggering amounts of energy, especially for lit crops and for high temperature crops such as tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers. All of it in sort of fixed equipment type basis, mains electricity, mains gas, and for keeping glasshouses warm and lit. And I work with organisations whose electricity bills and gas bills run into the many millions of pounds per annum. So yeah, you can imagine what the latest gas price challenges have brought to that industry. And then alongside that, we're talking about going net zero. And lots of people have made commitments to become net zero, not least the NFU. Minette spoke a few years back about making farming net zero by 2040. Multiples such as, well, in this case, B&Q for protected ornamentals, but many supermarkets are similarly got aspirations that their suppliers become net zero, sometimes even by 2030, which isn't very far away. We're talking about sort of about 8 years away now, which is quite close when you consider the scale of the challenge there is to reduce our emissions and to achieve these very ambitious goals. It's always useful at this point to make sure everyone's on the same page and to make sure that we understand what we mean by net zero. And clearly we mean reducing our emissions because that's what everyone wants to do, but it's more about making sure that the emissions that we emit are mitigated by the things that we do to offset those or to take up those emissions in other ways, so that in effect we have a net zero set of carbon dioxide emissions. The ultimate gold standard aim really is to get to gross zero, that we don't emit any carbon dioxide at all. But generally, it's felt at the moment that if you did that, you probably wouldn't be doing anything. You wouldn't have a business. You wouldn't be growing produce or doing anything at all. And therefore, gross zero is almost an unachievable aim as it stands. So we're heading for net zero, at least doesn't make the situation any worse. Now, alongside that, we can reduce our emissions as we're going through, not just offsetting them or taking actions to avoid emissions. And that, of course, will reduce the problem in terms of the larger CO2 stocks within the country and within the world. So net zero really means, to most people, reducing emissions and then taking actions to do something about the emissions that are unavoidable. So as part of the announcement that was made, the NFU, my policy colleague, so I don't work in policy at all, I work in sort of grassroots consultancy, helping people make actions. But my policy colleagues have sort of quantified where agricultural emission sources are. And the bar on the left, the orange and red bar, sort of shows the scale of the problem that agriculture is facing generally. And categorized in sort of three sources: nitrous oxide emissions from land, methane emissions mostly from livestock enteric fermentations, and carbon dioxide direct emissions mostly from energy or sort of released directly from combustion, etc., etc. And as you can see, by far the biggest impacts are those nitrous oxides at about 40%, methane about 50%. But the direct emissions, carbon dioxides from energy, etc., is about 10% of the major problem. In green, we've got the proposed actions that the NFU believes the agriculture needs to do as a whole in order to reduce its emissions and effectively achieve net zero. So you can see actions that take up carbon, such as carbon storage in farmland, capitalizing on the bioeconomy, and of course massive productivity improvements to reduce the size of the problem in the first place. In horticulture, we've got a sort of a fairly unique type of a position. I wouldn't say it's totally unique, but we're rare in that most of our emissions can be categorized through that carbon dioxide, deep red part of the column on the left-hand side. And that's because we're heavily dominated by energy, and transport and the other sorts of inputs we put in. We don't have land, we don't have animals, and therefore that those other two parts are far less impactful in terms of our emissions in total. But that's good news in a way, because we can actually tackle those emissions relatively straightforwardly, specifically in energy, as we'll hear about as we go through, and can make more immediate changes than maybe some people can do in other parts of agriculture. Again, when we talk about going towards net zero, we talk about the J word, the journey word, and the footsteps that you might take. It's really important, as we all probably understand, that we understand our emissions, where they're from, and that we measure them. And then we can be more efficient and reduce our inputs. And finally, we ought to be thinking about alternative resources and sequestration. And I would say that really we're still very much in that early stages. I think carbon footprinting last came around in about 2008 and kind of got lost in amongst the global economic crash and food miles and everything else that came around. And it's taken a while for it to come back around again. And we've forgotten some of that, some of those techniques. But we're in really that very much understanding and measuring position. I think Caroline was talking earlier about how many people are doing some form of carbon footprinting or greenhouse gas calculations, as they more rightly should be called, in the way that most people are doing them. So we're very much still in those first steps. We are doing some of these other things already, but not because generally of carbon, but more because of cost. And especially when you think about the latest energy prices, where we've seen gas prices today 5 times what they were this time last year, electricity prices 3 times what they were last year. That causes people to make very big choices about being efficient and reducing inputs in energy terms, if nothing else. And then very finally, of course, we ought to think about sequestering and alternative resources, but we're not in that state yet. Just to give those of you who aren't familiar with horticulture, commercial horticulture, just a couple of pictures of scales of commercial horticulture. We're talking of multi-hectares covered in glass structures. I think the largest one is a 15-hectare single-span glass house. The picture on the right is Thanet Earth, which is the largest single complex of glass houses in the UK. And that big sort of tank to the right-hand side of the HIAB lorry is a tank full of hot water. And you can see another one in the distance. And they generally tend to use energy to keep those glass houses warm, and they use very large battery stores of hot water to get them over the peak demands and to avoid sort of the requirements of electricity cost or gas cost. So energy generally goes into two things at that scale: very large boilers, 10 megawatts plus boilers, and very large combined heat and power plant running. Both of them tend to be running on mains gas. They have two big advantages. The first is that they can use mains gas, and therefore they are already relatively low emissions in terms of the other emissions other than CO2. There's not many particulates and other NOxes within gas, so they're already relatively clean burning. But also, both of those systems produce CO2, and CO2 is then used further to enrich the glasshouse environment to promote the growth of plants and to improve the yields. And so the challenge of moving away from fossil fuels to a large extent means that there might not be CO2 available from that combustion, and therefore the yields might fall, or alternative sources of CO2 for enrichment are going to be needed. And just in the corner of that, sorry, to the right-hand side of the boiler, which is the blue cylinder in the left-hand picture, you can just about see a flue gas condenser, which is cooling the gases to allow CO2 to go into the glasshouse. So yes, most energy in horticulture goes into heating the glasshouses and in boilers and in CHP plant. Typically, if you have a CHP plant, you're probably doing a lit crop as well. So you've got lights, and you're doing that to create out-of-season produce. And out-of-season produce for the supermarkets mean being able to sell tomatoes in December at Christmas time, so people can have a salad with their Christmas tea. And so, if you've got combined heat and power, you're making electricity as well as heat, then that becomes really important if you're going to think about a lit crop, because you want to avoid mains electricity costs. And CHP has been an economic way of doing that, because you can buy gas at the equivalent of maybe or could at 3 or 4 pence a kilowatt hour make electricity that was then valued at 6 or 7 pence a kilowatt hour, compared to mains electricity at 12 or 13 pence a kilowatt hour, and you could avoid significant mains electricity costs in that way. So yeah, another picture of a glass house, and you can see that sort of orange pinky glow where that has a mixture of sodium lights and LED lights in promoting photosynthesis and allowing people to crop throughout the winter months. Clearly, those sorts of crops have a much higher energy demand than even normal commercial horticulture, because they're aiming to produce a crop throughout the winter months, the colder months, and of course that's when most heating is going to be needed. Again, it's worth visualizing those emissions, making sure we're all on the same page. When we're talking about a ton of CO2, where might that come from? And we're talking about very large boilers, 10 megawatt, 20 megawatts of combustion at the extreme. But a 4 megawatt set of lights run for an hour is going to emit a ton of CO2 using mains electricity. A 6 megawatt gas boiler is going to do the same, just about an hour as well. And so, just thinking about how often these systems are operating gives you an idea of how many tons of CO2 might be being emitted by commercial horticulture in its consumption of energy. To take that a step further, two real world examples. On the left, we have a lit glass house maybe you know, 2 examples: an older type boiler and electricity, or a newer type boiler, but still emitting around about 12,500 tonnes to 14,000 and a bit tonnes of CO2 per year. And on the right hand side, if you've got an unlit crop, then clearly you're far less dominated by those electricity emissions. And if you're using mains electricity, then you're down at about the 5,000-ish tonnes of CO2 just for your energy requirement. As I've already mentioned, combined heat and power has been the sort of get out of jail free card for horticulture for, you know, at least 15 years or so, because of its cost efficiency. It produces lots of CO2, which the growers love to enrich their glasshouses. It produces electricity at a half price unit rate compared to mains electricity, and they can use all of the heat. So it's been a really big win for commercial horticulture. And when you don't need the electricity yourself, you can trade it onto the grid and make some money out of it, either as export cost or making support services that help the grid out in times of stress. And so when you compare the emissions from CHP against the benchmark standard boilers and electricity, you can see that it also helps out in CO2 terms. Not a huge amount, but it does help out in CO2 terms as it stands today. What really helps out, of course, is going to renewable energy, and that won't be a surprise to anybody, I wouldn't have thought. But the 2 sort of predominant sources of heat people are talking about for glasshouses at the moment. Biomass has had a real good lifetime over the last 9 years or so of the renewable heat incentive. And heat pumps have sort of had a bit of a go at it in the last 2 or 3 years. And in fact, that largest single span glasshouse I talked about is heated predominantly by heat pumps running off hot water from the East Anglian water as it stands. So yeah, if you put in renewable energy to avoid your mains gas or your mains electricity emissions, then clearly you can, in the lit crop, halve your emissions, and in the unlit crop, reduce them by 90%. So yeah, a really big impact, and one of the main strategies in terms of reducing your emissions from commercial horticulture. Now, just to take that a step further, and I'm going to sort of diverge away from those graphs for a minute and come back to them. There is natural decarbonisation for mains electricity in the UK. That's probably, again, not a surprise to many people, but we've turned off a lot of coal-fired power stations, and we've increased a little bit in terms of the amount of renewable energy that we've got on the grid. And therefore, when I came into the organisation around about 2004, 2005, our grid emissions for electricity are up around about the 480 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And today it's probably even less than 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So a real big change in those grid emissions. And that's really great news where you're going to be using renewable electricity in the future, because the national grid produce these future energy scenarios, they call them, and they reckon that we're going to decarbonise that even further. And by 2050, just renewables is going to allow for 76% of our electricity generation, let alone low carbon sources of nuclear and maybe electricity import as well. So it is really going to reduce those carbon emissions in electricity by a considerable amount. On the heating fuels, of course, there's less good news. Gas and oil heating fuels generally have around about 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour in them. This is an inalienable truth along the way. And we don't think that's going to change very much. We've heard a bit about biomethane today into avoiding transport emissions or off-road tractor emissions. But there's also clearly talk about putting biomethane into the natural gas network to decarbonise that. But the government's ambition is pretty small in that regard. And if we hit 10% of the total gas being produced by biomethane, I'll be surprised. And then there's talk about hydrogen blending in the future, up to maybe 20% in our natural gas network. So our natural gas network will decarbonise a bit, but unlikely to have the very big impact of decarbonisation that has already been had on the electricity industry. So if we're going to think about heating, we have to think about alternative heating sources, not about waiting for the grids to decarbonise themselves. And so we think about what else can we do? Can we put alternative fuels into CHP? Can we think about heat pumps in a more intensive way, and maybe some sort of bioenergy systems? Again, heat pumps are a pillar of one of the government's strategies to decarbonise the heat in total in the UK, mostly centred around domestic heat pumps, of course, and we've had some announcements of that in the recent days as to how they might up the amount of heat pumps that are being used in domestic heating. And of course, some simple numbers show you that the decarbonising works in that regard. Sorry, I just skipped too quickly forward, expected something else to build. Yeah, in terms of delivering a kilowatt hour of heat from a heat pump, it's considerably less by sort of a fifth compared to delivering it from a gas network. And of course, as agri-electricity gets less, then so that will fall even further. And so let's see that at work in terms of our previous graphs. So suddenly you're at 2050 sort of predicted emissions factors for electricity and for gas. And I may not even have been optimistic enough about the electricity. It might even be near zero in terms of its grams per kilowatt hour. We can see that going to a heat pump system or a biomass and mains electricity will reduce our carbon emissions to less than a tonne. Sorry, less than 1,000 tonnes compared to the 12,500 we're at the moment. It's interesting to look at the graph for this, the line for the CHP, and of course CHP shows the situation getting worse, because of course if that's based on running mains gas through your CHP, then it's making electricity that is more polluting than the electricity that it's seeking to avoid on the electricity network, and therefore you get a negative credit for that. And you are increasing your emissions by keeping with CHP, even an efficient CHP, in commercial horticulture in time. So not a long-term strategy. So what we see in commercial horticulture really is that the decarbonising of the heat side is the most important part. And the picture there is that is an article about that greenhouse that I've already mentioned a couple of times. And it's using waste heat from the sewage treatment works at a very modest temperature and using heat pumps to boost it to temperatures that are palatable within the glasshouse. And so we've got to think creatively about these heat sources, because again, a lot of commercial horticulture doesn't have land or enough land availability to go for ground source heat pumps, and may not be near rivers and lakes and so on to get water source heat pumps. They need to think creatively about what other sources of heat are out there that they can start to use to benefit from in their glasshouse structures. We also need to start thinking creatively about long and short-term energy storage, and are there ways of keeping some of that heat that we capture throughout the summer for using it in the winter, and whether that is recharging ground wells or something similar, so that we can improve our COP for winter months. I think those are areas that we need to very much investigate over the next few years. I do think bioenergy has a really important part to play. Just because the RHI has disappeared doesn't mean that it's not a sensible thing to invest in terms of biomass or other forms of bioenergy. Even if it is a transition system into something else, it is a way of reducing your carbon emissions relatively quickly in energy terms. Albeit it comes with that caveat of making sure you're not making the situation worse, and ensuring that you maintain and abide by your environmental permitting legislation. And just to give you a flavour for that, so that is the plant room of that very large glasshouse that's been built. A considerable amount of heat pumps. There's 16 of those heat pumps that you can see in those left-hand pictures, and some very large pipes of lots of water flowing around the system. So when you're investing in very large scale heat recovery through heat pumps, then this space considerations for plant rooms and the amount of water at low temperature you have to move around becomes not inconsiderable. Just to talk about a couple of projects that we're involved in, we've sort of recognised the issues that horticulture are coming up against, and that need for getting heat from other places, alongside an organisation called District Heating that have come at it from a different angle and seen the amount of what they call waste heat that is being emitted from industrial suppliers, and wondering whether we can match that into horticulture in order to benefit both sides of the coin. So we've just landed an Innovate UK project to research this into more depth and to create a matching system to somehow try and prove that commercial horticulture could benefit from some of this heat that is being emitted elsewhere. Now that might involve some pretty large compromises. You might have to move some factories, you might have to move some glass houses in order to make sure that the movement of heat is palatable. And of course, we mustn't forget CO2 in this as well. If we can move horticulture to places where heat and CO2 are available or vice versa, then clearly we can benefit from that too. One other project I think was worth mentioning, and because there was a chat question earlier through Benjamin's presentation about capturing methane directly out of animal buildings. We're also involved in an Innovate UK project that is looking at how you might capture that methane through some sort of passive system hung up in the apex roof of a cubicle shed to reduce those methane emissions at source. My personal view is that might be a bit tricky on the basis that most cubicle buildings are quite well ventilated, and therefore the concentrations of emissions at those points may not necessarily be as great as we would like. But that's why we're involved in that project. We're always looking for that sort of cutting edge, what's next, what might be beneficial to reduce emissions in agriculture as a whole. We're not just about horticulture, even though I've spoken about that quite a lot today. And whilst we're talking about capturing emissions, we mustn't ignore carbon capture particularly. And I see this picture that I've got on the bottom right is a picture that Caroline used in her slides as well. Direct air capture technologies are going to be a really important part of what we do to reduce our background CO2 emissions. Now, the question is, can we do something about that CO2, or can we use that CO2 more logically than maybe just pumping it into sequestration? And as I said, horticulture requires CO2 for enrichment. Maybe we can use those technologies to provide an alternative source of CO2 where combustion CO2 is no longer available. Whether that's from direct air capture, as in those big fans at the bottom, or whether we are taking it at more concentrated levels, such as out of power stations, such as DRAX, remains to be seen. But I would imagine it's easier to take it from the DRAX situation than it is, and more cost effective and efficient than it would be to take it from direct air capture. But we will benefit from that investment in that technology in horticulture, and we will see ways of using that CO2 and moving it around the country in the way that we do at the moment. Okay, sort of just taking the last sum up slides then. It's all about actions that we can take right now. As I said, 2030 is only 8 years away, 2040 is only 18 years away. And if you think about the advancements in technology over the last 8 or 18 years, we're going to have to take far bigger, considerable strides towards net zero than maybe we have done already. And so we do need to think about strategies to reduce our carbon footprint and our impact right now. And most people are thinking around the terms of buying their way out of the situation, buying offsets, using green electricity, green gas, or somehow taking energy from renewable sources. But my sort of call to arms is just we need to concentrate on the efficiency sides of things as well. Make sure that we reduce our consumption considerably before we then start to think about renewable energy or even reusing our resources in the way that we have. and keep ourselves prepared for the future. Our glass house of the future may not be a glass house. It may be a vertical farm. It may be a closed and sealed box. It may be that electric light becomes far cheaper than the mains powered heat. And therefore it's more palatable to think about our growing in a very, very different way. So preparing for the future is going to be really important. And I shall leave it there.
Okay, thanks for that, Jonathan. We are a little bit over on time, which will creep into people's lunchtime. There are a number of questions in the chat. I don't know whether you'd want to just have a look at those yourself, Jonathan, and see if you want to answer any, or we can finish for lunch. But I'm happy to run a couple of minutes of questions if you want.
Yeah, I'll pick out some fairly simple ones. Just thinking about greenhouse gas emissions used to grow out of season versus growing in season in other parts of the world. It comes down to a number of things, including what does the consumer really want? Do they want local? Do they want nationally produced produce? Do they want their tomatoes in December? And those are all the equations that people are grappling with at both grower and supermarket type level. In terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, I would imagine that it is considerably better in terms of CO2 emissions to grow out in the field in Spain than it needs to grow under glass in the UK. And that is the inalienable truth that we've got to grapple with. In terms of the CO2 producing the glass, that sort of life cycle analysis, no, I haven't considered any of that. This is just literally crop production on an annual cycle basis. So yes, it's not really in that term. And for the lit crop comparison, there will be a mixture of LED technology and sodium technology in that equation, because that is considered the best, most appropriate way of lighting a crop of tomatoes as it stands.
Brilliant. Okay.
So maybe I'll leave those ones there, because they're the fairly functional ones for that talk, and pick up the rest after lunch.
Yeah. Okay. That's brilliant. Thanks a lot for that.